Hello class! Today we'll be continuing our discussion about women in the 1950s, feminine mystique or feminine mistake, opposing viewpoints on the woman question in the 1950s, for undergraduate history of women in 20th century America. We've already discussed domesticity in the 1950s, post-war consumerism, and a bit about women's sexuality during this period. In this lesson, we'll zoom out to take a reflective look at the female experience as a whole during this period and consider some varying attitudes toward that experience. We'll cover Betty Frieden's happy housewife heroine. We'll consider the question, what about those who weren't housewives? We'll delve deeper into Betty Frieden's perspective on women's place in society and the rumblings of second wave feminism, and we'll also talk about anti-feminism during the same period. To begin, who was Betty Frieden? You've probably heard her name and the name of her 1963 masterpiece, The Feminine Mystique, but what do we know about her? She was born in Peoria, Illinois, worked as a journalist for women's magazines, and had a family of her own. She also founded the National Organization for Women. The Feminine Mystique was her response to the goings-on of the 1950s, and we'll talk about her assessment of 1950s American women here. In her book, she writes that fulfillment as a woman had only one definition for American women after 1949, the housewife mother. She used her experience in journalism to generalize the sentiment of the entire nation, obviously based on an ideal being represented in the media. Her editors continually turned down stories about working women. Career woman was a dirty word. The stories in the magazines should always have a housewife as the heroine, and she should be happy. Hence the title of her introductory chapter, The Happy Housewife Heroine. On the left here, you see a 1956 cover of Ladies' Home Journal featuring a mother and daughter. On the right, an issue of McCall's from the same year. It also features articles about motherhood, but Frieden highlights that in that same year, McCall's received the highest readership ever for an article that was entitled The Mother Who Ran Away. The popularity of this piece to Frieden spoke about women's boredom in the home and suggested that this story, one that broke away from the happy housewife heroine archetype in so many ways, was more relatable to the readership than any other articles on the conceived notion of accomplishing femininity. So the question is, who comprised the readership? Middle-class suburban housewives? Most likely. However, by leaving the entire 1950s to Frieden's perception of the bored suburban stay-at-home moms, we as historians neglect the rest of American women, like the Black and Latinx women, the urban poor, farm women working day and night to keep their families going, and working moms. In this module's readings, you learned about the prevalence of working mothers in the 1950s despite this archetype. In my own experience, all three of my grandmothers worked, in addition to striving to embody that ladies' home journal ideal of motherhood and wifeliness. But where are those women in history? Some of them were activists, incredible Black women fighting for voting rights and civil rights. We've talked about women missing from the overall American history narrative. The same is true of the civil rights movement. Although we know most about the male leaders of the 1960s, the origins of that movement were with grassroots efforts by women organizing in their local communities in the 1950s. Ella Baker was one of those women, who was actually the president of the New York NAACP chapter and ran for New York City Council in 1953. Those are topics we'll discuss more as we move into women's liberation, the civil rights movement, and other aspects of second and third wave feminism in the coming weeks, intersectionality. But for now, I just want to draw our attention to the fact that Frieden's assessment of the 1950s American woman is only assessing a segment of the population, and that segment is indicative of this renewed ideal of the Victorian sort of angel in the house. This perfect woman, piety, purity, submissiveness, domesticity, all of those attributes. So what did Frieden think about these housewives and what did she advocate for? This version of Feminine Mystique, this book cover, seeks to represent the lack of self, the missing identity of so many women who suppressed their own needs and became self-effacing wives and mothers. Frieden says, we can no longer ignore that voice within women that says, I want something more than my husband and my children and my home. Let's just sit with this for a moment. This is a notion, an idea, and a feeling that remains relevant today. When we think about continuity and change in this course and in all of history, this is a perfect example of continuity. A lot of women today would agree with and defend Frieden's point here. However, it can be a controversial statement because some women do find fulfillment in being a wife and mother. So let's pick at this controversy for a moment. If today some people disagree with Frieden, is what she said no longer true? We're now faced with the question of change. What has changed? What has not? Do women still feel as she did? Sure. Do some people feel that she was wrong and maybe is wrong still? Yeah. But let's think about this more critically. What about women's experience today differs from the 1950s? Even if women can be fulfilled by their roles of wife and mother, is the experience of being a wife and mother the same today as it was in the 1950s? What's different? This is something we'll contemplate in this week's assignments. We'll consider what it was like for working women in the 1950s and challenge ourselves to think about continuity and change in that experience. We'll also look at primary sources from the 1950s to see what those experiences really were like for other women. Throughout Feminine Mystique, Frieden argues for emancipation of women, rights for women, the freedom to be who they want to be. This book, and Frieden herself, launched the women's liberation movement, second wave feminism, to free women from the drudgery of self-effacing housework without stimuli for their minds. She closes the book asking the following questions. Who knows what women can be when they are finally free to become themselves? Who knows what women's intelligence will contribute when it can be nourished without denying love? Who knows of the possibilities of love when men and women share not only children, home, and garden, not only the fulfillment of their biological roles, but the responsibilities and passions of the work that creates the human future and the full human knowledge of who they are? She continues to say, it has barely begun, the search of women for themselves. But the time is at hand when the voices of the feminine mystique can no longer drown out the inner voice that is driving women on to become complete. Many women found this book, in their own words, life-changing. But not everyone agreed. So let's talk about those people. Who were they and why did they disagree? When talking about the 1950s, it's important to put things in context, like we've done in other lessons. Remembering that the late 40s and the 50s were important years for the Cold War. With fascist threats defeated, America shifted its focus to combating communism, socialism, Marxism, however you want to name those revolutionary threats to democracy. The feminine ideal of the 1950s, according to Rochelle Gatlin, contained many elements of traditional misogyny, but that after the Second World War, it was incorporated into a conservative political and social ideology with circumscribed options for both women and men. And therefore, feminism, like communism, was demoted to the status of a simple-minded, outmoded, and dangerous ideology. Social issues became psychological ones, and therefore feminism was just a symptom of female neurosis, as you would see in Freudian's phallocentrism. Taking it a step further, sociologists also talked about role conflict, just like in the feminine mystique. But they were hesitant and avoided blaming sexist institutions. That left an opening for anti-feminists instead to use and misuse medical terminology as a substitute for older moral and religious mandates. So feminism just became inextricably linked to communism, which weakened in conservatives' minds and in many leftists' minds, communism weakened the institution of marriage, the idea of motherhood, and suggested a loosening of women's sexual morality. As a response to the communist threat, Washington, D.C. centered rhetoric around fighting godless communism and creating the idea of a Judeo-Christian nation that was incompatible with such godlessness and moral ineptitude. This rhetoric also permeated the churches, and the whole Christian establishment was also on a crusade to fight communism, which was, as I said, linked to feminism. So in this period, conservative politics, namely anti-communism, was permanently entwined with anti-feminism. So people with conservative religious beliefs or conservative political views saw feminism and women's move into the public sphere as detrimental to the American nuclear family. And as a result, that would also be detrimental to the foundation of our nation. So this group of people also included women, which surprises a lot of feminists today. One in particular, Phyllis Schlafly, who supported family values and opposed initiatives like the Equal Rights Amendment. If you've watched Mrs. America, you might be acquainted with the struggle between feminists and anti-feminists, and you might have seen Cate Blanchett as Phyllis Schlafly. This was not abnormal. But again, we should pause and consider continuity and change. You know, even today, regardless of which side of the aisle you prefer, or whether you prefer a completely different aisle, you might relate to some of these arguments. And a lot of this ideology and this struggle with communism, socialism, and feminism continues to rule our nation's political stage. But at the same time, some of it has changed. During the 1950s, the idea of what women should or shouldn't be became even more political than it had already been. Women's sexuality and also homosexuality were tied to communism. And as McCarthyism raged on in this period, the fight against godless communism extended to a fight against feminism and in favor of traditional family unit, and in many ways perpetuating the oppression, or as John Stuart Mill named it in the 19th century, the subjection of women. Many feminist scholars argue that anti-feminism was in fact an effort to stifle women's sexuality, to minimize women's autonomy, and to increase their dependence on men and the patriarchy. Again, this is a controversial topic, and one that should be considered carefully. What's interesting about it is that Christians who believe that man is created in the image of God might argue for equality. Others believe in equality for different reasons, some don't. But at some point, equality and the question of it exited the stage, and a lot of ideological elements came into play. And it's at that point where our own life experiences, our own perspectives, and the influence of what we watch and read and inquire about converge, and we assess feminism on our own, and the role of women, and we place it within our own worldviews. So you can see here from new books, a podcast, the 50th anniversary edition of Feminine Mystique, that the debate rages on. So there is a lot to consider in learning the history and understanding how it relates to our lives today. So thanks for joining me in this conversation. Until next time.